Nobody wanted the wounded Apache woman, until a cowboy shut their mouths with gold. It was hard to see much from a distance, but as the figure drew closer, it became clear that it was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dust and blood, and she moved with great difficulty, each step seeming heavier than the last. She had been walking for what must have been miles, but she did not stop, even when her body screamed for rest. Somewhere far behind her, the echoes of conflict still haunted the land she had come from. She was an Apache woman, and she carried with her not only the marks of physical wounds, but also the deep, unseen scars of loss and fear. The small frontier town she approached was nothing more than a cluster of wooden buildings clinging to the edge of the prairie. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, and the sound of horses' hooves and the creak of wagon wheels drifted from the main street. Townspeople were beginning to stir, and as the woman limped closer, a few curious eyes peeked from behind doors and windows. She was unlike anyone they had seen before. Her skin was sun-browned, and her eyes carried a look of quiet determination mixed with a shadow of pain that made some avert their gaze. Most of the townspeople reacted with fear. There had been frequent conflicts with Apache bands in the region, and stories, many exaggerated or entirely false, had traveled ahead of her. Whispers started immediately. "It's one of them," an older man muttered. "She's probably dangerous." Another woman shook her head, muttering about how she should be sent away before she caused trouble. Even children, sensing the unease in their parents, began to shrink back. Yet the woman did not seem interested in causing trouble. She stumbled into the town square, clutching her side, where a wound glinted faintly in the sunlight. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, and with every step, it seemed as if she might collapse. People started to murmur more loudly, some stepping out to see if she was a threat. But the truth was clear to anyone who looked closely. This woman was in need, not danger. As she reached the center of town, a boy of about 12, bold in his curiosity, stepped forward. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice small against the rising murmurs of the crowd. The woman's eyes flickered toward him, and she nodded faintly, unable to speak clearly. The boy ran back to his mother, tugging at her dress and whispering urgently. Soon, the whispers turned into conversations, some questioning if someone should help her, others insisting she be chased away. It was in that tense moment that a man appeared from the edge of town. His boots kicked up dust as he walked with the calm assurance of someone used to moving alone across harsh landscapes. This was Eli Thompson, a cowboy known in the town not for fighting or arguing, but for his work as a trader and miner. People often said he had more silver and gold than anyone else in the area, yet he carried himself with a quiet humility. Today, however, his eyes were focused on the wounded woman, taking in the details, the blood staining her tunic, the fatigue written across her face, and the wary caution in her movements. Eli stopped a few paces away from the woman and raised his hands in a gesture of peace, addressing the crowd rather than the woman herself. "She's hurt," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. "She needs help." Some townspeople laughed nervously, uncomfortable with his statement. "Why should we care about her?" one man shouted. "She's one of them." Eli's gaze hardened, but he did not raise his voice. "Because she's a human being, that's reason enough." The crowd murmured, unease mixing with stubborn prejudice. They were caught between fear and compassion, unsure which to follow. A few stepped back, some nodded subtly in agreement, but most remained rooted in their fear. The woman, whose name was Nahel, sank slowly to the ground, exhaustion and pain finally overtaking her willpower. Her hands trembled as she pressed against her wound, trying to stop the flow of blood. Eli knelt beside her, speaking softly so the others could not hear. "You're safe now," he said gently. "Just hold on." He unfastened a cloth from his pack and began to carefully clean the wound, doing his best to ease the pain. Nahel flinched at first, distrust evident in her eyes, but she did not pull away. There was something in his presence that felt different from the fear she had felt all her life, a quiet strength that did not demand, only offered. The townspeople watched in silence, some leaning in, curiosity beginning to overcome fear. They could see the pain etched into Nahel's face and the careful, skilled manner in which Eli worked. For some, it was hard to reconcile what they had been told about Apache people with the reality in front of them. This woman was injured and alone, and yet here was a man willing to help her without asking for anything in return. Hours passed slowly. Eli worked tirelessly, keeping Nahel hydrated and cleaning her wounds as best he could with the limited supplies he had. He spoke to her softly, not expecting a response, sharing stories about the land, the town, and the people he had met along his travels. Nahel listened, her body too weak to respond, yet absorbing the sounds of calm, measured voices around her. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt a sense of safety. By mid-afternoon, the town's attitude had shifted slightly. A few brave women approached, offering blankets and food, their previous fear softened by Eli's example. Still, there were many who whispered behind hands, wary and suspicious. Eli ignored them, focused entirely on Nahel. He knew that trust would take time, and he was prepared to give it. The sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the town square. Nahel's breathing had slowed, and her pain was becoming more manageable. She looked up at Eli, her eyes meeting his for the first time fully, and in them, there was a faint glimmer of hope. She could not speak his language well, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. That evening, Eli helped her to a small, abandoned cabin on the edge of town. It was not much, but it offered shelter from the elements and a place where she could rest. He gathered supplies, including some food, water, and clean cloths, arranging them carefully around her. Nahel's eyes scanned the room, taking in the quiet order, the absence of hostility, and for the first time the possibility of survival. As night fell, the town settled into its usual quiet rhythm. Some still muttered in disapproval, but the events of the day had planted seeds of doubt about their assumptions. People began to realize that fear alone did not define reality, and that sometimes courage and compassion could bridge divides that seemed unchangeable. Nahel rested that night with Eli watching over her. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that even in a world filled with suspicion and fear, there were those who would act with decency and care. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grasses, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant memory of a life she had been forced to flee. The first part of Nahel's journey had ended not with a victory, but with survival and the promise of something more. For the townspeople, it was a lesson in seeing beyond their fears. For Eli, it was a call to act when others would not. And for Nahel, it was a faint but real spark of hope, a chance to live another day and perhaps in time to trust again. And though the story of the wounded Apache woman and the cowboy who refused to turn away had just begun, the quiet courage displayed that day would set the stage for a series of events that would challenge every heart in the town. The sun had set, but the promise of a new beginning glimmered on the horizon. Days passed slowly in the small frontier town. The sun rose and fell over the dusty streets, and life moved on as it always had for most of the townspeople. Yet a quiet tension lingered in the air, a subtle ripple caused by the presence of the wounded Apache woman. Nahel remained in the small, abandoned cabin at the edge of town, recovering under Eli Thompson's careful attention. Though she slept much of the time, the townspeople could see glimpses of her through the thin wooden walls. Her figure, once bent and fragile, was gradually regaining strength. Some people continued to whisper behind closed doors, voices filled with suspicion and old prejudices. "She doesn't belong here," said one man, tightening his coat against the morning chill. "Why should we care for someone from a tribe that fought against us?" Others were quieter but equally uneasy. There was something unsettling about seeing someone so different, living so close, and being cared for openly by a man as respected as Eli. Their minds were caught between fear, curiosity, and a small, reluctant sense of admiration. Meanwhile, Eli remained undeterred. He visited the cabin daily, bringing food and fresh water, tending carefully to Nahel's healing wounds. He spoke to her in soft, patient tones, telling her about the world beyond the plains, about towns he had traveled through and the people he had met. Nahel listened, understanding more from his gestures, expressions, and the kindness in his voice than from the few words she could understand. Slowly, she began to respond with small nods, soft hums, or hesitant smiles. The trust between them was growing, fragile yet strong enough to be a lifeline. Despite Eli's efforts, recovery was not easy. Nahel's wounds left her weak, and she suffered from exhaustion that seemed to come from deeper than just her physical injuries. Nights were long and restless. Often she would wake in pain or fear, memories of violence and loss flooding her mind. One evening she sat by the small window of the cabin, staring at the stars. Eli quietly joined her, carrying a cup of warm tea. He handed it to her, and she accepted it with a nod, her fingers brushing his in a tentative gesture of gratitude. He did not speak, allowing her to take comfort in the simple presence of another human being who meant no harm. Word of Eli's care for Nahel began to spread through the town. Some townspeople were surprised to see a man of his reputation, so committed to someone others considered an outsider. Curiosity overcame some of their fear, and they began watching from a distance. A few children, braver than their parents, approached the cabin under Eli's watchful eyes. They would leave small offerings of food or flowers, which Nahel accepted with shy nods. These small acts of kindness, though simple, were a reminder that even in a world clouded by fear and prejudice, compassion could emerge in unexpected ways. Yet, not everyone's heart softened. Some men in the town were determined to see her leave. They questioned Eli directly, asking why he was helping a woman from a tribe that had caused harm to settlers. She could be dangerous, one man warned. What if she has family who come for revenge? Eli met their concern calmly, without anger. I am not responsible for the actions of others, he said firmly. She is hurt and alone. That is enough reason to help her, nothing more. His words carried a weight that silenced them, at least temporarily. Many could not argue against the truth of his statement, though fear still lingered in their hearts. There was a growing tension in the town, between those who began to admire Eli's courage and those who refused to accept what they could not understand. Nahel's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. Eli taught her how to perform simple tasks again, such as fetching water, tending to small chores, and walking short distances. Every movement, every success was celebrated quietly by Eli, who knew that each step forward was more than just a physical triumph. It was a victory of trust, resilience, and courage. One morning, Nahel attempted to walk further than she had before. Eli walked beside her, supporting her with a gentle hand on her back. She stumbled a few times and her face contorted in pain and frustration, but she did not give up. Good, Eli said softly. Take it slowly. You're stronger than you think. His words encouraged her, and slowly she managed to reach the edge of the small cabin yard. For the first time in weeks, she could feel the wind on her face without fear, the warmth of the sun without pain. The townspeople could not ignore her progress. They watched quietly, some with cautious admiration, others with continued skepticism. It was becoming clear that Nahel was no longer the fragile figure who had stumbled into town weeks before. She was growing stronger every day, and Eli's unwavering support played a role that no one could deny. Despite the cautious change in the town's attitude, challenges remained. Nahel's presence was a constant reminder of old fears and prejudices. Some men continued to grumble about the danger she could represent, and a few women expressed concern over how their children might be influenced by her presence. Yet, slowly, small acts of acceptance began to appear. People would nod politely when they saw her on the street, or leave baskets of food outside the cabin without expectation of thanks. These were small gestures, but they mattered. Eli continued to stand by Nahel through every challenge. He understood that healing was not only about tending to physical wounds, but also about creating a sense of safety and belonging in a world that had rejected her. He spoke to the town leaders, reminding them of their shared humanity. "We are all bound by more than fear," he said. "We must act with decency, even when it is hard. That is what makes us strong." Some townspeople began to listen, even if only quietly. The story of the wounded Apache woman and the cowboy who refused to turn away spread slowly through the region. Travelers passing through town would hear whispers of the man who risked anger and suspicion to help someone others had rejected. It was not always enough to change hearts completely, but it planted seeds of thought that might one day grow into understanding. Nahel, for her part, began to regain a sense of her own strength. She learned to trust Eli, and through his care, she discovered that she could survive in this new world. Her steps became more confident, her gaze more alert. She was still cautious and still wary of the town's judgment, but she was no longer paralyzed by fear. She began to explore the small town cautiously, accompanied by Eli. Each visit to the market, each encounter with the townspeople, became a lesson in patience, courage, and hope. Eli also began to understand more about Nahel's past. Through gestures, drawings, and shared moments, he learned of the hardships she had faced, the loss of her family, the battles she had endured, and the long journey she had made to survive. Her story was heartbreaking, yet it was also a testament to her resilience. Each day, Eli's respect for her grew, and Nahel, in turn, found a steady presence she could rely on. As weeks turned into months, the town's attitude continued to shift slowly. While fear and prejudice were still present, the undeniable fact remained. Nahel was healing, surviving, and thriving with Eli's help. The town could no longer ignore the truth before them. Compassion, care, and courage had created a new reality. One afternoon, a group of children approached the cabin, carrying small gifts of fruit and bread. Nahel received them with a shy smile, offering gestures of thanks in return. Eli watched from nearby, pride shining in his eyes. This simple exchange was more than just a gesture of kindness. It symbolized a subtle but significant change. Even small hearts, influenced by trust and compassion, could begin to see beyond fear and prejudice. Yet, the story was far from over. Challenges remained, and Nahel's journey was only beginning. The wounds she carried, both seen and unseen, would continue to test her strength. The townspeople's fear and suspicion had not disappeared entirely, and there would be moments when courage and determination were all that could carry them forward. But for now, Nahel was alive. She was healing. She was beginning to see that even in a world that had once rejected her, there could be safety, trust, and even friendship. And Eli Thompson, the cowboy who had refused to turn away, remained her steadfast ally, guiding her with patience, wisdom, and unwavering kindness. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped low over the plains, the town settled into a temporary calm. Life was slowly returning to its routine, but a new chapter had begun. A chapter where courage, compassion, and trust could take root even in the most unlikely places. Nahel's journey was far from over, but the foundation of survival, hope, and growing acceptance had been laid. And the story of the wounded Apache woman and the cowboy who believed in her would continue to unfold, one day, one step, and one act of kindness at a time. Life in the small frontier town had settled into a new rhythm, but it was not without tension. Nahel's recovery was progressing, and she could now walk short distances on her own. She helped Eli with small chores in the cabin, carried water from the well, and even managed to tend to a small garden that had begun to flourish at the edge of the property. Yet, for all her progress, there were moments when fear and pain still gripped her, moments when the memories of violence and loss threatened to overwhelm her. The townspeople watched from afar, some beginning to soften their views, while others remained deeply suspicious. A few men especially whispered among themselves, questioning Eli's choices. "Why is he helping her?" one said. "What if her people come looking for her? What if she brings trouble to the town?" Their concerns were not entirely without reason. Tensions between settlers and Apache bands were real, and the fear of revenge or conflict lingered. Yet, for Eli, none of that mattered. His focus remained entirely on Nahel, on her healing, and on showing the town that compassion could overcome fear. Despite the growing trust between Eli and Nahel, the woman faced a new challenge. One morning, as she carried a bucket of water back to the cabin, she stumbled and fell, the pain in her side flaring sharply. She cried out softly, clutching the wound that had not fully healed. Eli, nearby, rushed to her side, kneeling immediately to examine her injuries. "Easy," he said gently. "It's all right, you're safe." But the fall had aggravated the wound, and despite his care, Nahel's condition worsened over the following days. Fever set in and she grew weaker, her body trembling with exhaustion. Eli worked tirelessly, cleaning her wounds, changing bandages, and trying every remedy he knew to ease her suffering. He even rode into the nearby hills to gather medicinal herbs, leaving the town behind for hours at a time. During this period, the townspeople were forced to confront the consequences of their earlier hesitation. Some had been curious, watching Eli's dedication and Nahel's struggle, but none had dared to step forward to help. Now, as her condition became more serious, murmurs of concern began to spread. "She's going to die if we don't help," one woman admitted quietly. Another man frowned, his pride warring with his conscience. For the first time, some began to understand the weight of inaction. Nahel, trapped between fear and pain, struggled to communicate. She could speak only a few words in the settlers' language, and her native Apache tongue was largely unfamiliar to the townspeople. Eli became her voice, interpreting gestures, drawing pictures in the dirt, and speaking gently on her behalf. "She needs rest and care," he explained to the townspeople. "If we ignore her now, it may be too late." Even with Eli's efforts, the situation reached a breaking point. Nahel's fever spiked, and she became delirious, murmuring fragments of memories and names that no one could understand. Eli stayed by her side through the night, refusing to sleep, whispering words of comfort and cooling her forehead with wet cloths. The townspeople could see the seriousness of her condition, yet fear and prejudice still held many back. Some were unwilling to enter the cabin, afraid of what might happen if she suddenly recovered strength or if her people arrived seeking revenge. One afternoon, a group of men gathered near the cabin, arguing about what should be done. "We can't just let her die," one said, finally breaking the uneasy silence that had settled among them. "But she's one of them." "How do we know she's not dangerous?" Another man shook his head stubbornly. "I don't care about her danger. We're settlers, it's not our problem." Eli, overhearing the conversation, approached the group calmly but firmly. "It is your problem," he said, "because she is human. Because she is suffering. Because ignoring her does not make the danger real, it only makes the suffering worse." His words carried the weight of conviction, and some of the men fell silent. Others shifted uneasily, unwilling to challenge him directly but uncertain of their own feelings. As days passed, Nahel's condition worsened. Eli realized that unless someone assisted him, her life might be lost. The risk to the town remained, but he also knew that waiting for moral courage alone would not save her. He needed to act decisively. One morning, he called the townspeople to the square, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "I am offering a reward," he announced. "A sum of gold to anyone willing to help care for her until she recovers." Not because I doubt your humanity, but because sometimes action must be motivated in ways people understand. The crowd reacted with surprise. Gold had always been a powerful motivator in the frontier town. Some men whispered excitedly, calculating in their heads how much Eli might be offering. Others frowned, their pride wounded, but they could not ignore the seriousness of his request. "You cannot leave her to die," Eli continued. "She will live if we act together, but she may die if we do nothing." The proposition changed everything. Where once fear and prejudice had held them back, now self-interest and the promise of reward encouraged action. Men and women approached the cabin cautiously, offering to fetch water, prepare food, and tend to her wounds. They worked under Eli's supervision, following his instructions carefully, while Nahel, still weak, accepted their assistance with quiet gratitude. Over the following days, the cabin became a hub of activity. Townspeople who had once whispered behind closed doors now actively participated in Nahel's care. They observed her bravery, her resilience, and the careful way Eli treated her, and some began to question their earlier assumptions. It became harder to see her as other, and easier to recognize her as a human being deserving of care and respect. Eli never demanded gratitude from Nahel, but he quietly encouraged the townspeople to see her as more than her past or her tribe. "She has suffered greatly," he reminded them, "but she is not weak. She is strong, and she deserves a chance to live, just like anyone else." His words began to sink in, planting seeds of empathy in hearts that had long been hardened by fear. As Nahel's strength returned, she began to take small steps on her own, moving around the cabin and tending to simple tasks. The fever passed, leaving her exhausted but alive. Her body bore the marks of her injuries, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. She began to observe the townspeople with quiet curiosity, noticing how they worked together under Eli's guidance, how they began to see beyond her appearance and past. The town itself began to change. The whispers of suspicion gradually transformed into conversations of acceptance. While not all hearts had been won, enough had changed to make a difference. The gold Eli had offered had motivated action, yes, but it was compassion, courage, and patience that ultimately allowed people to see Nahel as more than a stranger. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the prairie, Eli and Nahel sat outside the cabin, the air filled with the soft hum of crickets and the distant calls of night birds. Nahel rested her hand on Eli's arm, a small gesture of trust and gratitude that spoke volumes. "You saved me," she murmured, her voice quiet but clear. Eli nodded, smiling softly. "You saved yourself," he said. "I only helped you see it." The events of this period marked a turning point not just for Nahel but for the town as well. Prejudice and fear had been confronted with courage and kindness, and the results were undeniable. Yet, the journey was far from over. Nahel's wounds had healed physically, but the deeper scars of her past still lingered. The townspeople's acceptance was growing, but old habits and fears did not vanish overnight. As night fell, Nahel lay in the cabin, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had survived violence, prejudice, and fear. She had been rejected, overlooked, and ignored, but she had also been cared for, respected, and given a chance to live again. Eli's presence, steady and unwavering, had been a lifeline, a reminder that one person's courage could make a difference. The town, too, had learned lessons about humanity, courage, and empathy. They had seen that fear could be overcome, that action motivated by gold could evolve into action motivated by conscience, and that trust could grow even in unlikely circumstances. The foundation of change had been laid, but the coming days would test them further, as new challenges and decisions awaited. Nahel's breaking point had been reached, and she had survived it. The cabin at the edge of the town became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the fragile beginnings of acceptance. She had been pushed to the limits of her strength, yet she had endured, and in doing so, she had begun to change the hearts and minds of those around her. Eli remained her guide, protector, and friend, knowing that the days ahead would require continued patience, understanding, and courage. And Nahel, though scarred and wary, began to believe in the possibility of a future where she could live without constant fear, where her strength and spirit could be recognized, and where even the smallest acts of kindness could blossom into lasting change. The days after Nahel's recovery were different from anything the small frontier town had experienced. Life moved with a quieter rhythm, a rhythm shaped by care, patience, and the lingering sense that something extraordinary had occurred. Nahel, once fragile and cautious, was now walking with more confidence, moving through the cabin and the small yard outside with steady steps. She could carry water without fear, prepare simple meals, and tend to the small garden that Eli had helped her start. Her body was healing, but more importantly, her spirit was growing stronger. Eli remained by her side, guiding her through each task with calm patience. He never rushed her, never demanded more than she could give, and never spoke in anger or frustration. In his presence, Nahel began to feel a sense of trust that she had not experienced in years. She could laugh softly when something amused her, sit quietly without fear, and even share small gestures of communication that allowed Eli to understand her thoughts and feelings. Slowly, a bond of mutual respect and friendship took root, delicate yet powerful. The town watched these changes with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some townspeople who had once been openly hostile now brought small gifts to the cabin, a loaf of bread, a basket of fresh vegetables, or warm blankets for the night. Children approached without hesitation, offering flowers or curious glances, and Nahel would respond with shy nods or a soft smile. These simple acts of kindness were building bridges, creating a fragile but growing acceptance. Despite this progress, challenges remained. Not all hearts had softened, and some townspeople still carried lingering fear and prejudice. They watched from a distance, wary of her presence, uncertain whether to trust the change they saw. A few older men whispered warnings to one another, reminding themselves of past conflicts, while others debated whether Eli's gold or his compassion had motivated the community to act. Yet the undeniable fact remained. Nahel was recovering, thriving even, and the town could not ignore it. Eli, aware of these subtle tensions, continued his patient guidance. He encouraged Nahel to engage with the town in small, controlled ways. Together, they visited the market during quiet hours, Nahel observing the routines and interactions of the townspeople. She began to recognize familiar faces, learn the names of those who had helped her, and understand the patterns of life in this new place. Her confidence grew with each passing day, and even those who had doubted her presence began to see her not as an outsider, but as a part of the community, slowly earning respect. One afternoon, Eli decided it was time for Nahel to take a more active role in her own recovery. He suggested they repair an old fence near the cabin, a task that required physical effort, coordination, and trust. Nahel hesitated, unsure of her strength, but Eli encouraged her gently. "You can do this," he said. "Step by step. I'll be right here." She nodded and began. Her hands, once weak and trembling, now grasped tools with determination. Together, they lifted beams, hammered posts, and patched the fence. Sweat ran down their faces, but by the end of the day, the fence stood strong, a visible symbol of Nahel's growing strength and determination. The townspeople noticed the change. Those who had helped initially, motivated by Eli's gold, now began to act without hesitation, bringing more supplies, offering advice, or assisting with small repairs. Their actions were no longer driven purely by reward, but by a recognition of Nahel's humanity and resilience. Gradually, the town's fear and suspicion began to melt, replaced by a cautious admiration and respect. Nahel also began to communicate more clearly, using simple words, gestures, and drawings. She shared stories of her past, moments of beauty and hardship, and lessons learned from the life she had endured. Eli acted as her interpreter and guide, ensuring her voice was heard and understood. In doing so, they created a bridge between her world and the town, allowing understanding and empathy to flourish. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nahel and Eli sat outside the cabin, watching the colors of the sky shift from gold to deep blue. Nahel reached out and touched Eli's hand, a gesture of trust and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered in her soft, simple words. Eli smiled gently, shaking his head. "No," he replied, "thank you. You remind us all what it means to be strong and brave, even when the world seems against you." The seasons began to change, and with each passing day, the bond between Nahel and the townspeople strengthened. She learned the rhythms of daily life, how to help with chores, tend to animals, and even assist in small town tasks. Her presence became a quiet but undeniable influence on the community. Fear and suspicion slowly gave way to acceptance, and the town began to see the value of kindness, courage, and persistence. Eli also encouraged her to explore the surrounding land safely, allowing her to reconnect with nature in a way that reminded her of her past. Together, they walked the plains, observed wildlife, and discovered small streams and hidden groves. These excursions were not just about survival or exploration. They were about reclaiming a sense of freedom, a feeling that life could be lived fully and without constant fear. Meanwhile, the town itself began to change. Stories of Nahel's recovery and courage spread beyond the immediate community. Travelers passing through remarked on the wounded woman who had survived against the odds, cared for by a cowboy who refused to abandon her. The tale inspired conversations about compassion, trust, and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. Even those who had remained skeptical began to acknowledge the truth in what they saw. But Nahel's journey was still one of careful steps. Despite her growing strength, she remained aware of her differences, aware of the past that had shaped her, and aware of the fragility of acceptance in a place still haunted by fear. She had learned to trust Eli completely, yet she remained cautious with others, understanding that trust had to be earned. Each interaction with the townspeople became a lesson in patience, courage, and subtle negotiation. One day, Eli suggested that Nahel take part in a town event, helping to organize food and water for a small gathering. She hesitated at first, unsure of how the townspeople would react, but Eli encouraged her gently. "You've come so far," he said. "They need to see what you can do. They will respect you for your strength, not fear you." With Eli's guidance, Nahel participated, moving carefully among the townspeople, assisting wherever needed. Her confidence grew with every interaction. Children approached her without hesitation. Adults nodded politely, and even the skeptics observed quietly, unable to ignore the remarkable transformation before their eyes. By the end of the day, the event was a success, and Nahel had taken another important step toward full acceptance within the town. Through it all, Eli remained a constant presence, guiding, protecting, and supporting her. He did not force change or demand recognition. Instead, he allowed Nahel's actions, courage, and persistence to speak for themselves. And as the weeks passed, the town began to see that she was not a threat, not an outsider to fear, but a person of remarkable strength and resilience. The quiet evenings at the cabin became moments of reflection. Nahel would often sit with Eli, watching the sun set over the prairie, sharing stories through gestures, simple words, or drawings in the dirt. She began to dream again, not of the past she had lost, but of the future she could build. Each day, her strength grew, her confidence blossomed, and the foundation of a new life began to take shape. By the end of this period, it was clear that the recovery was not just physical but emotional and social. Nahel had grown from a frightened, wounded woman into a resilient, confident figure within the town. The townspeople had been challenged to confront their fears and prejudices, and many had risen to the occasion, learning lessons in empathy, courage, and compassion. The journey of recovery was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. Nahel had survived, healed, and begun to thrive. She had forged bonds of trust with Eli and slowly, with the community. The town had learned the power of patience, kindness, and courage in the face of fear and prejudice. And as the sun set over the prairie, casting a warm glow over the cabin and the surrounding town, the story of survival, hope, and quiet transformation continued to unfold, promising a brighter future for all involved. The following weeks brought a new kind of life to the small frontier town. Nahel, once fragile and cautious, had grown stronger and more confident each day. She moved through the town and the cabin with ease, her presence no longer a source of fear but a quiet symbol of resilience. Children ran to greet her, adults nodded respectfully, and even some of the most skeptical townspeople began to offer small acts of kindness on their own. What had begun as a story of survival had become a story of connection and change. Eli remained her constant companion, guiding her gently while allowing her independence to grow. He did not insist she follow his way or his words, but encouraged her to make decisions for herself, to take ownership of her new life. Together they explored the nearby hills, tended to the garden, and walked through the town streets. With every step, Nahel learned more about this world she had been forced into and about her own strength within it. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Some townspeople still carried fear or prejudice, remnants of old stories and mistrust that could not vanish overnight. Nahel was aware of their glances and whispered comments, and she approached interactions with a careful balance of caution and openness. Yet she no longer allowed their judgments to dictate her life. Instead, she focused on building her place in the town and proving through her actions that she was strong, kind, and deserving of respect. One day, a family approached the cabin with a small gift, a basket of fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread, and a few tools to help with her garden. Nahel received the gifts with a shy smile, offering nods of thanks and a few words in the settlers' language she had been practicing. The family's eyes softened as they realized that their gestures were met with gratitude, not fear. In that moment, a subtle but profound change occurred. The walls of suspicion that had long separated her from the town began to crumble, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Eli watched these interactions with quiet pride. He had seen Nahel's journey from the brink of death to full recovery, and he understood the significance of each small victory. "You've done this yourself," he said one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I only helped guide you. You faced your fears, your pain, and your past, and you survived. That is your strength." Nahel's eyes glimmered with quiet emotion. She had endured so much loss, fear, pain, and rejection, but she had also discovered resilience, trust, and the possibility of acceptance. Her journey had not been easy, but it had taught her that courage and patience could carve a path even through the hardest times. She had learned that survival was not just about escaping danger, but about finding ways to live fully, even in a world that had once seemed hostile and unwelcoming. As the town observed her growing confidence, they too began to change. The story of Nahel and Eli became a lesson in empathy, courage, and the power of action. People began to see that fear alone could distort reality, and that small acts of kindness could create ripples of change throughout a community. Those who had initially acted out of self-interest began to act out of genuine care, recognizing the value of compassion and the importance of supporting those in need. Nahel's presence also inspired others in the town. Children, who had once been wary of her, began to include her in their games and activities. Young women and men saw in her a model of resilience, learning that strength was not only physical but also emotional and moral. Even the older generation, hardened by years of fear and suspicion, could not ignore the quiet impact she had on the town. Slowly but surely, the community began to embrace a new understanding of courage, trust, and humanity. One afternoon, a traveling merchant arrived in town, bringing news from nearby settlements. He spoke of Eli Thompson and the wounded Apache woman, recounting the story of her survival and the kindness that had allowed her to live. Travelers and neighbors alike were astonished by the tale. Many had expected danger, conflict, or tragedy, yet they found instead a story of resilience, compassion, and quiet transformation. The merchant's words spread far and wide, carrying Nahel's story beyond the small town and reminding people of the power of courage and empathy. Nahel herself continued to grow in confidence and independence. She began to tend more responsibilities in the town, assisting with chores, helping care for animals, and teaching children the skills she had learned during her recovery. Her presence became a stabilizing force, a reminder that courage and perseverance could inspire others. She learned to navigate social interactions with care, understanding the subtle dynamics of trust and respect, and gradually, the town began to recognize her as an integral part of the community. Eli encouraged her to take on small leadership roles, offering guidance when necessary but allowing her to make decisions. Together, they repaired fences, planted gardens, and helped rebuild areas that had been neglected. Nahel's contributions were recognized and appreciated by those who had once doubted her. She had become not only a survivor but a figure who could influence positive change, demonstrating that courage, kindness, and resilience could reshape even the most cautious hearts. Despite the many successes, Nahel never forgot the hardships that had brought her to this point. The loss of her family, the battles she had endured, and the fear she had experienced remained part of her story. Yet she carried these memories with grace, using them to strengthen her resolve and to teach others the importance of empathy, patience, and understanding. Her journey became a symbol, showing that even those who have faced the greatest adversity can rise, adapt, and thrive. Eli, too, reflected on the lessons of the past months. He had always known the value of courage and compassion, but witnessing Nahel's journey had deepened his understanding of what it meant to act with integrity in the face of fear. He realized that true strength was not in confrontation or wealth but in patience, guidance, and unwavering support. Through his actions, he had not only saved a life but had also taught a community how to see beyond fear and prejudice. As the seasons changed, so did the town. The once quiet streets now carried a sense of life and energy, shaped by the bonds that had formed through care and compassion. Nahel's garden flourished, children played under the shade of trees, and adults worked together with renewed purpose. The town had been transformed, not by wealth or force, but by courage, patience, and the simple act of seeing another human being's worth. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and red, Nahel and Eli sat together outside the cabin. The air was warm and the distant sounds of the town carried softly on the breeze. Nahel reached out, placing her hand gently on Eli's arm, a gesture of gratitude and trust. "You saved me," she said softly. Eli shook his head, smiling. "No," he replied, "you saved yourself. I only helped you see your strength." In that quiet moment, both reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Nahel had faced unimaginable hardships, yet she had emerged stronger, braver, and wiser. Eli had acted with courage and compassion, standing by her side when others had faltered. Together, they had not only survived but had helped the town confront its fears, prejudices, and doubts, leaving behind a legacy of empathy and understanding. The story of Nahel and Eli became a lasting memory in the town. People remembered the wounded woman who had arrived in pain and fear, and the cowboy who refused to turn away. They spoke of courage, resilience, and the power of small acts of kindness. Visitors who heard the story were inspired, and the town itself became a quiet example of how understanding and empathy could transform even the most skeptical hearts. Nahel's life continued, shaped by her experiences but no longer defined by fear. She learned to trust fully, to act with courage, and to embrace the possibility of happiness. She had survived, healed, and thrived, proving that strength could grow even in the harshest of conditions. Her story, once one of suffering and rejection, had become a testament to resilience, hope, and the enduring power of human kindness. Eli remained by her side, a guide, friend, and companion, sharing in the quiet victories of each day. Together, they continued to build a life rooted in trust, compassion, and courage. The town, too, had learned a valuable lesson, that true courage was not in confrontation, nor was respect earned through fear. It came from understanding, patience, and the willingness to act when others might hesitate. As the final light of the day faded, Nahel looked out over the prairie, her heart filled with quiet strength and hope. She had endured loss, fear, and rejection, but she had also discovered courage, kindness, and the possibility of a new beginning. The town, once suspicious and fearful, had grown alongside her, learning lessons that would remain long after this chapter had ended. Her journey, marked by struggle and triumph, became a story to be remembered, not just as a tale of survival, but as a lesson in empathy, patience, and the transformative power of human courage. Nahel had faced her deepest fears, and in doing so, had changed not only her own life but the lives of those around her. And so, under the vast skies of the prairie, with the town behind her and the future stretching endlessly ahead, Nahel's story came full circle. From a wounded, rejected woman to a symbol of resilience and hope, she had proven that courage and compassion could overcome fear and prejudice, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come.